Now, joining us from London is Henry Ridgwell, Voice of America Europe correspondent. Henry, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. The sentiment coming out of South Africa is celebration that this is a watershed moment. What is the sentiment coming out of London and the rest of the West?
Well, we're yet to get any significant reaction so far, really, from Israel's allies here in Europe or from the United States. We understand that it's possible that President Biden and the White House may react to the ruling in the coming hours. We've had some reaction from foreign ministers. For example, Lord Cameron here in the UK has said that Gaza is working towards a ceasefire, that Britain is working towards that, but no specific reaction yet to the ruling itself from many world leaders on this side of the world. And I think that reflects the complexity, really, of the ruling itself. As you say, South Africa has welcomed the ruling, welcomed the fact that the ICJ said that it did have the jurisdiction to rule on this, which meant that South Africa's presentation merited investigation by the court, and that investigation into the case of the charge of genocide brought by South Africa will be investigated over the coming months and years. But the explicit request from South Africa that a ceasefire was ordered by the court, an interim measure, was not there. The rulings, as you've been outlining, said that Israel must make every effort to protect the Palestinian population in Gaza. And I suppose that is open to interpretation by Israel itself and interpretation by Israel's allies. So the reaction, I think, from allies will be key in measuring the impact that this ruling may have. We know already that Israel has pretty much rejected the court's ruling itself. Netanyahu has called the consideration even that it is carrying out genocide as outrageous and said it is fighting a just war. Israel's defense minister Ben Gvir wrote on X, formerly Twitter, simply Hague Schmeig. That was his reaction. So we know that Israel is reacting strongly against the ruling, but pressure from its allies, along with pressure from the ICJ ruling itself, may force Israel's hand, and that may change conditions on the ground in Gaza. But we wait to see what impact this will have in the coming days.
Well, this is still early moments, Henry. Can we take that as a sign that the allies have not had a reaction as yet? Can we take it as a sign that, as you say, that they probably will add more pressure on Israel? Because with that statement coming out from Israel Prime Minister rejecting the ruling from this afternoon, he also said that Israel's commitment to international law remains unwavering, in the same statement as he's saying that they reject the ruling that has been made by international law.
Yeah, it's tricky, isn't it? And without an explicit call for particular measures on the ground in Gaza from the judges at the ICJ, I think there will be concern among certainly some Palestinians and their supporters that this may give enough vagueness or wiggle room, if you like, for Israel and its supporters to argue that they are already doing every measure they can to ensure that those provisions under the Convention on Genocide are being upheld, that they are doing everything they can to prevent genocide of the Palestinian population, because that's not what they're trying to do, that they are trying to prevent the killing of civilians. They will go back to the evidence that they presented in The Hague 2 weeks ago on, for example, showing that they have given warnings to Palestinian civilians purportedly before they launched airstrikes and so on. And whether Israel's allies will also stick to that line that, for example, reiterating what the United States has called for, which is for Israel to allow more aid into the Palestinian territories, into Gaza. And that's exactly what the ICJ has demanded as well. So it's possible the White House could simply underline that the ICJ has reiterated its own demands as well. Is there a level of open interpretation of these rulings that will allow for the ruling not to have as big an impact as South Africa hoped? It's difficult to say yet. And without hearing from, for example, President Biden and other world leaders, particularly those strong allies of Israel, Rishi Sunak here in Britain, Chancellor Scholz in Germany, and so on, Macron in France, then until we hear from them and their interpretation, it's impossible really to measure the amount of international pressure that will be exerted upon Israel. But having said that, I think we've seen in the United Nations in New York several votes at the UN General Assembly calling for a ceasefire with big majorities there among UN members. We've seen 3 resolutions brought in the UN Security Council, all of them vetoed by the United States, calling for a ceasefire. And now with an International Court of Justice ruling underlining the need to adhere to these conventions on genocide and calling for protection of the Palestinian population, I think if Israel were to refuse and to completely ignore those rulings, then that added sort of court of world opinion, the global pressure on Israel and the willingness for it not to be seen as a pariah in the world may tell on the Israeli government and may force it to reconsider its operations in Gaza. Of course, another key milestone is that month from now when the court has ordered that Israel has to come back and outline how it has ensured that it is complying with these interim measures. That will be key to see what Israel does, to see what evidence it brings back, and perhaps it will be a measure of how seriously Israel is taking this ruling today.
And is it also a matter of how much skepticism should we actually receive these messages once we do have reaction from world leaders of the West? Because it seems there is a case of saying one thing, as the US has said, there should be more humanitarian aid distributed around Palestine. However, they are also still providing the weapons that are killing Palestinian people. So we say one thing and we do another thing. So how much skepticism should the world be receiving these messages of reaction from these world leaders once they do speak?
Well, that's a very good question, and I think always reactions from world leaders and these sort of geopolitical diplomatic relations that we see unfold should always be taken in the context of the situation at hand and also their domestic situation. Of course, with Israel, by far their closest ally and biggest provider of weapons is the United States. There is some legal discussion over whether, given that an investigation will commence now following today's ruling on the claims by South Africa that genocide is taking place against the Palestinians in Gaza, whether those who supply the weapons to allegedly enable that genocide that South Africa claims is taking place further down the track, should that accusation from South Africa be upheld by the judges, then do those states, the United States, Britain and others who provide weapons to Israel, would they be complicit in the crimes that the judges in The Hague say would have happened if they say genocide had taken place? That's a consideration that the White House, Washington and their legal advisors are going to have to consider as well. On the case of how much skepticism should be taken from these pronouncements from world leaders, well, I guess that's for each individual to judge for themselves. The accusations of hypocrisy, of course, are not new against many world leaders and against anybody involved in these institutions. There are umpteen cases stretching back decades, centuries of double standards. But most recently, of course, with the Ukraine war ongoing as well, and Russia's bombing of Ukraine and the civilian toll there. Just for example, Russia claims that it bombed hospitals in Ukraine, some hospitals because the Azov battalion, which it claims was a Nazi fascist group in Ukraine, Russia said that they were holed up in hospitals, and that's why those locations were targeted in Ukraine. But the United States has called on Russia to stop doing that. Well, is there a double standard that they won't call on Israel to stop doing the same in Gaza? So, these accusations won't stop, this ruling won't stop those accusations of hypocrisy. But I think what it does do is up the stakes for all of those parties involved in this, and it brings the issue and those accusations of hypocrisy and the standards that these countries hold themselves to and hold other countries to, it brings it much more into the public eye. And that's in an election year in the United States as well. That brings added pressures. Will Joe Biden want to speak against Israel during an election year when he's under pressure from Republicans? All questions that we'll find out in the coming months.
Indeed, it is a crucial election year globally. Thank you so much for joining us and for your insights. That was Henry Ridgwell from Voice of America, the Europe correspondent based in London.